Welcome to what I would consider the grand part of my PhD thesis and work to date. Right, does this clicker work? Oh, it does. Oh, it's cut off, but it's fine. For some reason that's cut off, but that is absolutely fine. Basically, it's a mission statement. Basically, the work I've done in my PhD has basically tried to look at this relationship between games and coping. And pretty much we know that games can support, and we know why they support coping during periods of difficulty, but we don't necessarily understand the how. We don't know how specific game aspects may support the coping process, and in particular, I know Laura's just gone through me, and I've put different types of games. I was literally changing it to not say that, but across different types of games, and to sort of basically, you know, my first study sort of saw some preliminary relationships, but I was like, hang on a minute, this is just like preliminary stuff. You know, it's an exploratory thing. I can't really capture the in-depth dynamic process underlying the relationship between the games and the game aspects across participants who are going through periods of difficulty, say grief, mental health challenges, job loss, basically when shit get bad. I might swear, I'm not going to apologize for that, so get used to it. But there's basically a gap in understanding around the mechanisms through which player, you know, coping can kind of come about, and if it's across different types of games. So we basically formed 2 research questions. If you know what this game is, you'll know in like 2 seconds what I talk about. But basically, it's basically how do various game aspects of video games influence the coping strategies of people experiencing personal difficulties. I don't know why that's cut off, but sure, welcome to PowerPoint. It's fine. But basically, I'm trying to see if the relationships I saw for my first study come out in study 2. And then, from that, how do they vary across different game types? Because again, Laura spoke about player experience and social play. I also wanted to see if this relationship between games and coping does manifest across different game types. Is there something unique about the experience of going through something difficult that games offer, or is there something unique that different types of games can afford? So that's kind of where this comes. I did this through a constructivist grounded theory. Yes, I have a death wish. Anyone who's laughing is in the support group. Congratulations. So I did it with Kathy Sharmaz, using that, used Tom Cole's work as well, and Wrong with Burks and Mills. We did 17 participants across, I think it was 8 male, 5 female, 2 non-binary and 2 self-identify across a range of ages, across a diverse range of difficulties. I didn't want to just have a bunch of people who'd gone through a mental health challenge. I wanted a range of difficulties which we captured. I data gathered through semi-structured interviews, through Zoom, and the data analysis process. I went through 3 phases of coding, doing theoretical sampling every time. I'm not going to talk about the CGT process too much because there's books on it. You've read it. And something that I end up looking at is trying to find case study games that I could talk to participants about. I'll go into this detail shortly. And then something that's very kind of important in grounded theory and qualitative research, full stop, is this idea of reflexivity and ethics. In terms of my epistemological position, this understanding that we co-create, my interpretation of the data is factored in by my experience as a Middle Eastern brown woman, you know, who has gone through a lot. So I wrote a positionality statement to kind of reflect that in the research as well. I think it's very important to do that. If we don't reflect who we are when we interpret stuff, who are we really to kind of really understand this process? So that's kind of the research design. So why the specific game? So Disco Elysium, everyone, hands up if you played it. Hell of a drug. So Disco Elysium was chosen, so every game on this list was in the first study as someone who had played it. I have also got experience with all of these games as well, and I chose them to resemble different game aspects that could be presented. So Disco, it was really chosen for its sort of narrative and character elements, which allow to explore identity, failure, self-reflection. You know, it's got the skill check system, the thought cabinet as mechanics to provide unique ways for people to internalize thoughts and have that sense of self-reflection. Darkest Dungeon, who's played Darkest Dungeon? Hell of a drug, I love this game. This was selected for its challenging gameplay because it's very central to the core design. The people at Red Hook, I think it is, really kind of spoke about this, you know, stress being part of the gameplay experience. So I wanted to kind of go, okay, what is it about Darkest Dungeon that can kind of, you know, you've got these uncertain outcomes, you've got these high pressure situations. players can probably indirectly learn about how to reframe stuff and, how they might react in adverse situations through the stress, affliction, and the virtue mechanics that are in there. And then finally, who's played Stardew Valley? What a hell of a drug. This game's also very good. This was included for its simulation aspects. This was a big thing that came out of Study One. In terms of supporting, establishing routines, there is a lot of COVID work that talks about Stardew Valley. I think there's people in this room who've studied Stardew Valley. But I wanted to kind of look at it in the focus on this structured daily routine, the sense of community building that is there, and sort of the simulated social interactions that might give people sort of milestones and things that they can do in game that they may not necessarily do in real life. So, we talked to a bunch of people, we talked to 17 people, we did a bunch of research. It was amazing. It took a hot minute, but we did it. So what are the results? So, I'm not going to go through this too much, you can ask me about this, but effectively, when I did the grounded theory, I ended up identifying 6 key game aspects. So there's the narrative, which is around sort of character arcs, player-driven choices. There is choice and consequence, which is kind of, I'm going to call it decisions with repercussions. When you make a choice, what happens? There's character development, which is character growth, relationships. There's game environment, which is sort of the visuals, the audio, the atmosphere. And then structured gameplay, so task presentations, routine pacing. And then the coping strategies, which basically this graph is just basically showing these are the coping strategies, which I'll go through momentarily, and then the influencing game aspects that seem to be pertinent within that coping strategy across all the games studied. So processing emotions is exploring emotions through game parallels. Reframing thoughts is sort of transferring skills, gaining new perspectives. Seeking temporary refuge is my way of basically saying not escapism, and someone will ask me about that, but I'm going to seek it out now. But it's effectively about reprieve and having a structured disengagement for mental relief. So it's not purely escapism, it's this sense of I need a break from what's happening, games are allowing me to do that. Someone's nodding, thank God. Developing self-understanding is this idea of like personal growth and using gameplay insights to kind of like reflect on yourself. And then building competence. Any SDT nerds will know that this is around kind of building achievement capability in life. So this is across all the 3 games studied, all the participants. But what you now notice across when I look at each game in turn is that each game, with the exception of developing self-understanding, which is prevalent across all 3 games, there are unique coping signatures that then transpire in every single game, and the game aspects that are particularly pertinent to the game seem to actually influence the coping strategies that manifest. So I was like, well, that's interesting. Let me kind of go through them a little bit in depth in terms of the actual grounding of the data. So Disco Elysium, as we said, it has this narrative depth, it has this, interactive character development through your relationship with Harry, Kim, a bunch of the NPCs. And what sort of happens is it creates this environment for like processing emotions and developing self-understanding. The idea that this game is talking about failure, it's talking about politics, it's talking about loss, alcoholism, whatever it may be, kind of offers this space for essentially a structured reflection on yourself and your identity and your values through the eyes of the character. You're kind of coping through playing disco, and that is helping you kind of have that mirror to your lived experience. So this was a lot of things that people spoke about, particularly with people with mental health challenges that the participants spoke about, which kind of brings it together, which I can talk about. Darkest Dungeon, these are obviously some examples of people, effectively reflecting some of these examples. This is cut off, but I'll kind of talk about this. So Darkest Dungeon, as we saw in the previous slide, is really emphasis on challenge. It's kind of, structured difficulty, progression. This sort of fosters this development of reframing thoughts and building competence. This kind of deliberate difficulty, the fact that there is RNG, the fact you don't know if your heroes are going to die, and the uncertainty that Darkest Dungeon sometimes presents actually gives players a sense of a model of handling pressure. Like in this particular quote, I remember the participant interview, and kind of they're talking about working in a project management environment, and actually Darkest Dungeon gave them the catalyst to be like, you know what, shit's gonna go wrong, but I've played Darkest Dungeon, I can deal with all that. Surely I can then handle that in my real life. So it's about reframing the thought, reframing the negative thought patterns, and kind of going, you know what, maybe I can apply some of these lessons I've learned in everyday life. Which I was like, that's amazing. And then Stardew Valley is, it takes the serene environment. I mean, I know it's basically spreadsheet.game, but, the people who talked about Stardew, this kind of low-pressure environment, it creates this space where players can kind of, like, again, seeking temporary refuge, the predictable cycles, this kind of emotional breathing room and kind of encouraging interactions where you might not have it in real life. And I think that's, it kind of links to that some element. Thank you, my darling. So I think that by allowing Stardew for players to feel relaxed during difficulty through these kind of structured gameplay and game environment, it allows players to kind of, and that sort of feeling that I sort of really get quite passionate about. I'm glad to see it. So what does this all mean? I did a grounded theory. Folks, presenting theory. I'm not going to tell you how long it took me to make this graph because it makes me cry. But it led to this notion of games as dynamic coping systems. So I'll go through this. So fundamentally, at its core, you have the player with all their stuff, their needs, their experiences, what they're going through. And the theory emphasizes that it's not so much about the player playing the game, then the coping happens. It's not just a linear thing. It is actually the interaction between the player and the game aspects of a particular game that actually creates and helps facilitate the coping opportunity to help develop the strategy. So it's actually not about, like, I play game, I cope. It is the fact that you're engaging with certain game aspects. Those game aspects give you an opportunity to develop coping and actually, like, reflect back on it as a thing. And then from there, as you can see, it is a dynamic model. It sort of feeds back in. You have the coping strategies that are then built from the players. Then there is a sort of a coping outcome, so increased resilience, increased well-being, a better understanding of self. And then, because it's, psychological research, this is actually a feedback loop. This feeds back into the player to further understand themselves. There's a kind of, the player experience, kind of, it's a dynamic recursive thing. And sort of you have this sort of coping construction through the interaction that then kind of feeds into it. So there's different ways that it kind of built into it. I can explain this more in questions and things like that. But fundamentally, it is a dynamic coping system that is happening. It is not just games help me to cope. It is certain game aspects help facilitate the process of coping and such that we can then develop that moving forward. I can talk about this for hours, but I don't have the time. So, looking at it, what's the impact of the actual research that happens? I think there's sort of 4 kind of key areas that there's sort of like takeaways. So we can see that actually from the work I've been doing, game aspects actually can support coping for players at different times. We can see it's not just like about the game and the experience, but it's how they interact to support coping. It could be, participants spoke about at one point in their coping journey, it's like, I needed games to kind of help me not think about what's happening. And actually later on, they kind of reflect back and go, actually, I want to engage with this as like a challenge and like to reflect back on it. So it's good that you can see that the dynamic coping is starting to sort of manifest itself. The unique coping strategies of different game types. Again, Laura, I know I should have, different game types is the whole thing. But different games seem to offer unique coping signatures. This is very interesting from like a game development view because we can probably begin to see how we can leverage certain game types within and certain game mechanics in different game types to kind of if you're building a sort of self-care game that has themes around maturity and things like that, maybe don't put someone dying in the first 2 seconds of the game. Heavy rain. So just think about it in terms of leveraging that in terms of having this unique coping signatures, especially if you're making games that are there to support well-being, full stop. This is kind of the more theoretical stuff. A lot of this work that I've done in my PhD has kind of built on the work of transactional coping models by Lazarus and Folkman from I feel like 10,000 years ago now, but I think from since 84. But this actually now can be, because that was very much in psychology, this is actually now we can see that within games that the transactional coping model actually can be reflected into video games, which for me gives me, there's a potential mediation relationship between how you have a stressor and then the coping resource and response. And then finally, positioning games as sort of an accessible dynamic coping resource. This is something I'm very passionate about. This is kind of the work that I'm doing. I've only got a minute left, so I'm going to basically pass through some of the other work in terms of what's next. I'm basically interested in moving forward in seeing if that dynamic coping system changes over time and whether, if your behavioral change happens, does your gaming behavior also reflect that? So I'm basically extending the grounded theory right now to try and look at identifying participants with different life experiences to track that change. This is some of the initial open coding that's coming out. We're very in early stages, but if you're interested in temporality and games full stop, please come talk to me, because this is an area I'm very interested in trying to finish off the narrative of the PhD. And I don't know whether my last slide's gone, but there we are. There was a last slide. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. And yep, any questions for Sahar? Okay. Let's see.
Wow. I was like, thanks, guys. No questions. Hi, Philip.
Hi. Yeah, very interesting presentation. A question I had was concerning different game aspects and how they feed into the coping strategies. Did you find that there was a distinct difference between like game mechanics, like gameplay, and like narrative aspects of the game, and how they've facilitated different coping strategies?
Yes, I would think so. There's definitely, I mean, you can go down the weeds of it. Go read my first study if you want to go through the weeds of every single game aspect. But certainly in this study, you could definitely leverage certain different game mechanics for different coping experiences. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one relationship, but I'm saying that certainly narratives seem to lead more into the kind of more self-reflective, meaning-focused components, where things like challenge, progression seem to leverage more like a sense of competence and building towards something. In that way. So I think that the mechanics can definitely impact the coping, and that's sort of something I'm trying to say moving forward in the thesis. But it's not a sort of, I can't just quantify it yet and be like, this equals this. If you want to have like a emotional focused coping experience, these are the game mechanics you need to leverage. I say it's a bit more nuanced, but I think certainly from a game developer, certainly there's certain levers we can pull moving forward. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
No worries. Senor Cole, Anne. There's two more questions.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, but maybe we can have one question.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. Does that mean you could look at, basically categorize all games and kind of go, like you could have a site and go, oh, I want to deal with this, I'm going through this at the moment, what games should I play? You could kind of...
That's the vision. That would be the ideal vision. If you gave me all the money in the world and all the time in the world, that would be lovely. But I think that at least for players, in terms of contribution, thinking ahead, it would be nice to be like, look, there are, if you have an intent, if you're looking for intended experience, there are certain games that maybe facilitate that more than others. We'll talk to you, because Brown and Cairns was very influential in the early work of my PhD. So that's kind of where I'm looking at. But yeah, it's obviously not a perfect system. Is that it?
Thank you. Yeah, if you have more questions, then yeah, feel free to reach out to Sahar.
You'll hear me, don't worry.